I traced the name on his headstone again with my finger, and then again. Somehow it made me feel like the old Nick. The one tickling me on the hallway floor outside the bathroom on the second floor of his house was more alive than he'd ever been. "I don't hate you," I whispered, and then I repeated it louder. "I don't." A blue jay answered me in a tree off to my left. I searched the leaves and branches with my eyes, but never found it. "It's about time," said a voice behind me. I jumped and rolled around, falling off my knees and onto my butt. Deuce was sitting on a concrete bench behind me, leaning forward, hands dangling between his knees. "How long have you been sitting here?" I asked, trying to slow my heart by resting my palm on my chest. "Every day since he died. What about you?" "I didn't mean that." "I know." We stared at each other for a minute. Deuce's stare felt like a challenge, like the way a dog will stare down another dog when it's ready to fight. "So what are you doing here now?" he asked. I locked eyes with him, this time doing the challenging myself. "You can't chase me away from here," I said, "and I don't know why you blame me so much anyway. You were his best friend. You could have stopped the shooting too." "You were the one with the list," he countered. "You were the one who spent the night at his house 2 days before the shooting," I snapped, and then added softly, "We can do this all day. It's stupid. It's not going to bring anyone back." A car rolled up and an old man gingerly piled out of the back seat, then picked his way to a grave nearby, holding flowers at his hip. We watched him as he knelt slowly, his head bent over, his chin nearly touching his chest. "The cops? They questioned me too," Deuce said, still looking at the old man. "They thought maybe I was in on it because I hung around with him so much." "Seriously? I never heard that." "Yeah." "I know," he said, his face sour. "You were all about poor you, poor Valerie. You were shot. You were grieving. You were a suspect. You never even considered any of the rest of us. You never even asked, man, how the rest of us were doing. You totally just ditched us." I looked at him, stricken. He was right. I hadn't asked Stacy during our one visit how anyone else was doing. I hadn't called anyone, emailed, nothing. I hadn't even considered it. "Oh my God," I whispered, and suddenly I could hear Jessica's voice in my ear. "You're just selfish, Valerie." "I'm sorry. I didn't think that Detective Panzella practically lived at my house, man. Took my computer and everything," Deuce said. "But the real kicker is, I really had no idea. Nick never said anything to me about shooting anybody. He never even warned me or anything." "He didn't warn me either," I said, but my voice was almost a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Deuce." Deuce nodded, fumbled in his pocket for a cigarette, took his time lighting it. I felt really stupid for a while, not knowing. I figured maybe we weren't as good of friends as I thought. And guilty, too. Like, I should have known, and then I could have done something. Helped him. But now? I don't know. Maybe he didn't tell us to spare us. I let out a sarcastic grunt. Well, if he did plan to spare us, it so didn't work. Deuce chuckled softly. No kidding. The old man was struggling to his feet again, pulling his jacket tight around him as he headed back toward his car. I watched him. "You remember the time we went to Serendipity together? The water park?" I asked. Deuce chuckled. "Yeah. You were a drag that day. All whiny about being cold and hungry and nag, nag, nag. You wouldn't let him have any fun." "Yeah," I said. I looked back at the grave. Nicholas Anthony. "And at the end of the day, when you guys took off and Stacy and I had to look all over for you, and we finally found you eating Oreos with those 2 blonde girls from Mount Pleasant?" Deuce's grin widened. "Those girls were hot." I nodded. "Yeah, they were. And do you remember what I said to Nick when I found you there?" I looked up at Deuce. He shook his head no, smiling, hands dangling. I told him I hated him. I said it in those words. "I hate you, Nick." I reached down and picked up a dry leaf and began flaking it to bits with my fingers. "Do you think he knows I didn't mean it? You don't think he died thinking I hated him, do you? I mean, it was forever ago, and you know, we made up that day, but sometimes I worry that he still thought about me saying that, and that maybe On the day of the shooting, when I tried to stop him, he remembered me saying I hated him back at Serendipity, and that's why he killed himself. Because he thought I hated him. Maybe you do hate him. I thought about this and then shook my head. I loved him so much. I let out an exasperated laugh, shaking my head. My tragic flaw. That's what Nick would have called it, had I been one of the suffering characters in one of his beloved Shakespeare tragedies. I heard a scraping of clothing against concrete. Deuce had moved to one side of the bench and was patting the concrete next to him. I got up and sat next to him. He reached down and picked up my hand. He was wearing gloves, and the warmth of his hand enveloped mine, radiating through my whole body. "Do you think he did it for me?" I asked softly. Deuce thought about it, spat on the ground at his feet. "I think he had no idea why he did it, man. It was a possibility I'd never considered before. Maybe I couldn't have known what Nick was about to do because Nick himself didn't even know." He let go of my hand, which quickly grew chilly again without the warmth of his glove around it, and slid his arm around me. Made me feel weird, but not entirely in a bad way. In some ways, Deuce was the closest to Nick I'd ever been again. In some ways, it felt like Nick's hand behind me, Nick's warmth beside me. I leaned my head back into the hollow of his shoulder. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "If you loved him so much, why weren't you here before now?" I chewed my lip. I thought it over. Because I didn't really feel like he was here. He was still so much everywhere else I looked, I didn't think it was possible for any part of him to be here. "He was my best friend," Deuce said, "you know." "He was mine too." "I know," he said. There was an edge to his voice, but it was very soft. "I guess... whatever." We sat there in silence for a while, both of us staring at Nick's grave. The wind picked up and the sky darkened, and the leaves swirled around my ankles in tighter and tighter circles, making them itch. When I began to shiver, Deuce pulled his arm away from me and stood up. "I've got to go." I nodded. "See ya." I sat there for a few more minutes after Deuce left. I stared at Nick's grave until my eyes watered and my toes felt numb from the cold. At last I stood up and brushed a leaf off of the headstone with my toe. "Bye, Romeo," I said softly. I walked away shivering and didn't look back, even though I knew I'd never again go visit his grave. He was Ma's beloved son. The words carved in the granite said nothing about me at all.